The wind did not howl so much as it screamed, a relentless white fury that scraped across the endless plains and piled snow against anything bold enough to stand in its way. It was a wind that stole breath and hope in equal measure. Through this blinding, frozen scourge, a figure moved, a dark, stumbling stain against the pure white. It was a woman, her name long since forgotten by the world but held tight in her own heart, Liana. The last of her strength was a small, guttering flame, and the storm was determined to blow it out. Each step was a war, each breath a knife of cold in her chest. She had passed the last farmstead 2 days prior, seen the smoke from its chimney but received no answer to her frozen knocks. This valley, they had said in the last town, held one more place, the furthest out. A rancher, they muttered, a quiet man who kept to himself. It was her final throw of the dice before the table of her life was cleared for good. The homestead appeared not as a sanctuary, but as a mere suggestion in the swirling white, a darker smudge that slowly resolved into the low, sturdy shape of a log house, a barn clinging stubbornly to its side, and a fence line half buried. There was no welcoming glow in the windows, only the faintest promise of solidity. She fell against the heavy door, her mittened fist making a sound against the wood that seemed pitifully small to her own ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but the wind's shriek. Then, a latch clicked, and the door opened just enough to reveal a man, his frame filling the space, backlit by the weak firelight of the room behind him. He was not old, but life had etched its signature firmly upon him. His hair was the color of dark earth, and his eyes, a flinty gray, assessed her without a trace of softness. This was Cale, a man whose conversation was with the soil and the seasons, not with strangers. He saw a wraith, shrouded in ice-stiffened wool, her face pale as the moon save for the dangerous flush of cold on her cheeks and the dark, desperate circles under her eyes. Her beauty, if it existed, was buried deep under exhaustion and hunger. "Please," was all she could manage, the word cracking in her dry throat. He did not move to let her in. "The road is behind you. There's no one here." "Not the road," she gasped, her body beginning to tremble now that it had stopped moving. "Shelter. Just a night. I can work." "I've no coin for hired help," he said, his voice flat, final. He began to close the door, a barrier against the cold and the complication she represented. Panic, sharper than the cold, lanced through her. This was the edge. The truth was all she had left. She shoved her foot forward, stopping the door's swing with a soft thud. Her eyes met his, and she let him see the raw, unvarnished truth of her desperation. Not for coin. His gaze hardened, understanding dawning, and with it, a flicker of something, disgust, perhaps, or pity. She could not bear pity. "I have nothing," she stated, the words clear now, stripped of all pride. "No food. No family. My body is the only currency I possess. Give me shelter. Give me food. Let me stay until the winter breaks. And in return, I will come to your bed. Every night. You may use me as you wish." She forced herself to hold his stare, to not flinch from the brutal honesty of the offer. It was not seduction. It was a transaction, laid bare on the frozen step between them. The silence that followed was filled by the hungry wind. Cale looked past her, into the swallowing white, then back at her shaking form. He was a man of simple needs and simpler company. Loneliness was a familiar blanket, but it was not deadly. Leaving her out here was. And her offer, however shocking, was pragmatic. A life for a body. He gave a single, curt nod. "Come in." The warmth of the main room hit her like a physical blow, making her skin prickle and ache. He bolted the door against the storm and pointed to a stool by the stone fireplace. Sit. Get warm. He moved to the hearth and ladled a portion of stew from a pot hanging there into a wooden bowl. He handed it to her without a word. She ate like an animal, the rich, savory flavor almost painful. He watched her, his expression unreadable, then fetched a rough wool blanket and draped it over her shoulders. The kindness in the gesture, small as it was, threatened to unravel her completely. She clutched the blanket tight. "The rules," he said, his voice low. "You do your share of the work. Days are for chores. Nights," he paused, the weight of the arrangement settling in the room. "Nights are for the bargain. You will not refuse me. My room is there." He gestured to a door off the main room. "You will come when I tell you. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes on the fire. "I understand." When the meal was done and the dishes cleaned, the reality pressed in. The fire crackled, the only sound in the heavy quiet. Finally, he stood. "It's time." He did not offer his hand. He simply turned and walked to the bedroom door, leaving it open. Liana rose, her legs unsteady. She followed, crossing the threshold into a sparse, clean room dominated by a large bed made of peeled pine logs. A single candle burned on a chest. Cale was already removing his heavy shirt. He did not look at her. "Get in," he said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that brooked no discussion. With fingers numb from more than cold, she fumbled with her own layers, the borrowed dress, until she stood shivering in her thin chemise. She slipped beneath the heavy quilts on the far side of the bed, her back to him. She heard the rustle as he undressed, felt the dip of the mattress as he climbed in beside her. The warmth of his body was immense. He did not speak further. A calloused hand found her hip and turned her onto her back. In the faint candlelight, she saw his face above hers, still stern, but now with a new intensity. She closed her eyes tightly, a final retreat. He was not rough, but he was direct. His hands moved over her, learning the geography of a stranger. His touch was methodical, a claiming of the terms they had agreed upon. When he entered her, she stiffened, a small sound catching in her throat. He stilled for a moment, then continued with a slow, steady rhythm. Liana detached her mind, letting it float somewhere near the ceiling, away from the sensation of a stranger moving inside her, away from the confusing mix of relief at being safe and the shame of the price. It was over sooner than she had feared. He withdrew, rolled onto his back beside her, and blew out the candle. "In the sudden, total darkness," he said, "until spring." She lay still, feeling the unfamiliar heat of him beside her, listening to the storm rage against the walls that now protected her. She had traded for this shelter, for this survival. The bargain was sealed. But as she lay there, a single, hot tear escaped her shut eye and traced a path down her temple into the coarse linen of the pillow. She had her shelter. And he, in the dark beside her, stared at the ceiling, wondering why the act that was meant to sate a simple need had only left him feeling emptier than before. The dawn after that first night arrived not with a brilliant sun, but with a gradual, gray lightening of the world, the storm having exhausted itself into a steady, silent fall of flakes. Liana awoke to find herself alone in the bed, the space beside her cool. For a long moment, she lay perfectly still, taking inventory. The profound warmth of the house, the solidity of the mattress, the absence of the gnawing, twisting pain in her belly, these were real. The memory of the previous night was real too, a dull, private ache that centered her in the strange new reality of her existence. She rose, dressed quickly in her own worn clothes, and ventured into the main room. Cale was already at the hearth, stirring oats into a pot. He glanced at her, his expression the same unreadable mask as the day before. There's water to fetch, he said, his voice a low rumble. After you eat. It was not a request, but it lacked the harsh finality of his words on the doorstep. It was merely the first task of the day. The bargain in motion. So began the pattern of their days. Liana fell into the rhythm of the ranch with a determination born of necessity. She learned the heavy, iron pump handle in the yard that brought up achingly cold water, her breath pluming in the air as she filled the buckets. She learned the particular, distrustful gaze of the milk cow, and the gentle touch needed to persuade it. She mended a tear in his coat with surprisingly neat stitches, the needle moving with a muscle memory from a life before. She swept the hard-packed earth floor and baked simple, dense bread from their stores of flour. She worked in silence mostly, but it was a different silence than the screaming void of the storm. It was a silence filled with purpose. Cale watched her, not openly, but from the corners of his eyes as he chopped wood, repaired a harness, or sorted through seed packets for the spring planting. He saw the weariness in her frame begin to ease, replaced by a lean strength. He saw the way she did not shirk from the messy or difficult tasks, her hands growing red and chapped but never still. One afternoon, he came in from checking the fence line to find her on her knees, carefully resetting the stones that edged the fireplace hearth, her brow furrowed in concentration. He said nothing, but later placed a cup of warmed cider beside her before returning to his own work. The nights continued, the unspoken centerpiece of their agreement. He would indicate with a nod or a quiet tonight that the terms were to be met, and she would follow him to the bedroom. But a subtle shift, glacial in its slowness, had begun. The first few times were a near replica of that initial encounter, functional, quiet, a transaction completed in the dark. But one evening, as his hand moved over her ribcage, he felt her flinch not from cold or fear, but from a ticklish sensitivity. He paused, his hand still. The next night, he noticed the way her breath hitched, just slightly, when his palm brushed the side of her neck. He began to experiment, not as a lover, but as a man mapping unknown territory. His touches became slower, more deliberate, seeking not just to take possession but to discover what elicited a catch in her breath, what made a muscle in her jaw go tight. Liana, for her part, fought a silent, internal war. Her mind insisted on remaining detached, a floating observer to this nightly ritual. But her body, warmed by consistent food and hard work, began to develop a treasonous awareness. The calluses on his palms, which once felt only rough, now registered as specific textures against her skin. The heat of him, once just a oppressive presence, became a source of comfort in the cold room. One night, as he moved over her, his lips accidentally brushed the shell of her ear. A jolt, entirely unwelcome and shockingly pleasant, shot down her spine. She bit her lip to stop a sound. He felt the tremor that ran through her and, emboldened by some instinct he didn't name, did it again, deliberately. This time a soft, shaky sigh escaped her before she could lock it away. The following day, the thaw outside seemed to find a parallel within the walls of the house. While repairing a hinge on the chicken coop, Liana smashed her thumb with the hammer. A sharp cry escaped her, and she dropped the tool, clutching her hand to her chest. Cale was beside her in moments, his work forgotten. "Let me see," he ordered, his voice tight. Gently, but firmly, he pried her good hand away. The thumbnail was already purpling. Without a word, he led her inside, sat her at the table, and fetched a basin of clean snow. He wrapped a handful in a cloth and pressed it to the injury, his large, work-roughened hand cradling hers with unexpected care. The pain was sharp, but the strangeness of his focused attention was a greater distraction. He did not let go until the throbbing subsided. That evening, he did not give the usual signal. They ate their stew by the fire, the quiet between them now companionable rather than empty. When it was time to sleep, he simply stood and said, "Come to bed." The phrase, minus the commanding "my" or the, felt different. That night, under the quilts, he did not immediately reach for her. They lay on their backs, listening to the wind. Then, he turned onto his side, facing her. In the deep gloom, she could just make out the outline of his features. His hand came up, not to claim, but to trace, slowly, the line of her jaw from ear to chin. It was a touch of pure curiosity, almost reverence. Her own hand, of its own volition, rose from the quilt and came to rest, tentatively, on his side. She felt the powerful muscle there, the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When he finally kissed her, it was not a prelude to possession, but a question. And when she answered, her lips moving softly against his, it was the first conscious choice she had made in his bed. Afterward, he did not turn away. Instead, he pulled her back against the solid wall of his chest, his arm a heavy, secure weight around her waist, his breath warm in her hair. She lay awake long after his breathing evened out into sleep, utterly still, afraid to break the spell. The ache of her body was different now, a deep, humming warmth that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with the unfamiliar, terrifying sensation of being held. The ice around her heart, thicker and older than the winter outside, had not melted, but it had, for the first time, developed a hairline crack. The true thaw, when it came, was not a gentle transition. It was a messy, violent fracturing. The sun gained strength, turning the world into a symphony of dripping and rushing water. The pristine snow collapsed into sodden, gray mounds, revealing the frozen mud and forgotten debris of autumn beneath. The path to the barn became a treacherous mire, and the air inside the cabin grew thick with the dampness of wool drying by the fire and the earthy scent of wet soil pressing at the door. This external unraveling seemed to seep into the very timbers of the house, amplifying the strange, new energy that now crackled between its two inhabitants. For Liana, the careful detachment she had worn as armor was in tatters. Cale's touch was no longer a transaction to be endured but a language she was desperately, secretly learning to speak. Her body had become a traitorous ally, responding to him with a will of its own. A brush of his fingers as he passed her a bowl could send a flush of heat across her skin. The low timbre of his voice giving simple instructions about the storage of root vegetables could make her stomach tighten. At night, in the dark, she found herself waiting, a coiled tension of anticipation humming under her skin before he even reached for her. She began, shyly at first, to explore him in return, the hard plane of his stomach, the surprising softness of the hair at his nape, the powerful curve of his shoulder under her palm. Each discovery was a secret thrill, a piece of a map leading somewhere she was afraid to name. Cale, too, was adrift in uncharted waters. The woman he had taken in as a bartered comfort had become a constant, captivating disruption. He watched the way she bit her lip in concentration when kneading bread, the way a stray curl would escape her braid and cling to the damp skin of her neck. The stoic rancher who needed nothing found himself thinking of things to tell her, an observation about the early return of a bird, a memory of the farm from his boyhood. The silence between them was now filled with these small offerings, and with a heavier, more potent quiet that hung in the air after their eyes met across the room. His desire for her had transformed from a simple, physical urge into a deep, aching pull that resided in his chest as much as his loins. It was a need not just for her body, but for the quiet sound of her breathing beside him, for the sight of her moving through his space as if she belonged there. The pressure built like the sky before a summer thunderstorm, dense and electric. The final break came not from without, but from within. It began over something absurdly small, the last of the dried apples. Liana had used them to make a tart, a small luxury she'd hoped would please him. Cale, seeing the depleted store, had spoken without thinking, a gruff comment about the need for rationing until the first greens appeared. It was practical, but his tone carried the ghost of the man who had bargained for a servant, not a partner. Something in Liana snapped. All the fear, the shame of her position, the terrifying vulnerability of her growing feelings, boiled over. "Do you wish for me to account for every crumb?" she fired back, her voice trembling with a fury that shocked them both. "Should I present a ledger before I earn my keep in your bed?" The words landed like a physical blow. Cale's face darkened. "This is not about the apples," he growled. "Then what is it about?" she cried, throwing her hands up. "Tell me, so I may perform my duty correctly. Should I be more quiet? More still? Shall I simply be a warm vessel and not trouble you with my presence by the fire or my use of your apples?" "Stop it," he commanded, his own anger rising to meet hers. "You twist my meaning." "What meaning?" she shot back, tears of rage and hurt now spilling down her cheeks. "The meaning of our bargain? I have not forgotten its terms, sir. I lie beneath you each night. I know my place." "Your place?" he roared, the word exploding from him. He took a step toward her, his frame rigid. "Is that what you think this is? You believe I see a servant? A bought woman in my home?" He raked a hand through his hair, frustration pouring off him. "I do not want the woman who made that bargain. That woman is a ghost. She is gone." The air left Liana's lungs. She stood frozen, staring at him. His voice dropped, rough with an emotion so raw it was painful to hear. "I want you. The one who argues with me over apples. The one who mends my shirt with stitches finer than I deserve. The one who looks at the returning geese with wonder in her eyes." He closed the distance between them, his gaze burning into hers. "I want the woman who kissed me back. I want her. Not a ghost from a snowstorm." The confession hung in the damp air, more real and more terrifying than any storm. The last pretense of their arrangement lay shattered at their feet. Liana searched his face, seeing not the stern bargainer, but a man laid bare, his own fear and longing mirroring her own. With a sob that was both grief and release, she launched herself at him. It was not an embrace of passion, but of collision, of two lost souls crashing together. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her with a force that stole her breath. Then his mouth found hers, and it was nothing like the careful, questioning kiss from before. This was a conflagration. It was all the unsaid words, the repressed longing, the fury and the fear, transmuted into pure, desperate sensation. There was no guiding her to the bedroom. They stumbled against the heavy table, then sank to the rug before the fire, still half-dressed, their hands tearing at buttons and laces not as a prelude, but as an urgent necessity. This joining was a revelation. There was no bargain here, only a voracious, mutual claiming. His mouth was everywhere, on her lips, her throat, the swell of her breast freed from her chemise. Her nails scored his back, not to push him away, but to pull him closer, to brand him as hers. When he entered her, it was with a deep, shuddering groan that she echoed, her legs wrapping around his hips to take him in completely. The rhythm was not slow or methodical, but frantic, a race toward a precipice they both needed to leap from. It was a conversation of gasps and broken words, her name on his lips, a ragged yes on hers. The pleasure was not a quiet spark but a lightning strike, arching her back and tearing a cry from her throat that was swallowed by his kiss. He followed her over the edge moments later, his own release a guttural shout against her shoulder, his entire body shuddering with the force of it. Afterward, they lay tangled on the floor, the firelight dancing over their sweat-sheen skin. The world had narrowed to the feel of his heart hammering against her own, the rise and fall of his chest beneath her cheek. He shifted, not to withdraw, but to cradle her more fully against him, one hand stroking her hair with a tenderness that made her eyes well up anew. No words were needed. The storm had passed, and in its wake, the landscape between them was forever changed. The bargain was dead. Something alive, wild, and fragile had been born in its place. The fragile world they had built in the firelit cabin seemed to solidify in the days that followed the storm within. The air itself felt different, charged not with tension, but with a profound and quiet recognition. They moved around each other now with a new ease, their hands seeking brief, grounding touches in passing, a brush of fingers as he handed her a tool, her palm resting lightly on his arm as she leaned to look past him out the window. The nights were no longer a separate country marked by a silent signal, but a natural, hungry extension of their days. Their joining was now a dialogue of discovery, slow and savoring one moment, urgent and breathless the next. He learned the exact spot at the base of her spine that made her gasp. She discovered the way his control frayed into a helpless groan when she traced the shell of his ear with her tongue. In the warm darkness, words began to mingle with sighs, not promises, not yet, but truths whispered against damp skin. You feel, I need, don't stop. Spring, true spring, began to assert itself with a boldness that mirrored the change in their hearts. Patches of stubborn snow retreated to the deepest shadows, and the first brave shoots of green pushed through the dark earth. With the softening ground came the resumption of travel, the world slowly reconnecting its isolated dots. They had almost forgotten the outside world existed. The reminder arrived on horseback one afternoon. Liana was in the kitchen garden, turning the cold soil with a digging fork, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Cale was at the far end of the pasture, repairing a section of fence weakened by the winter's weight. She heard the horse first, the steady clop of hooves on the damp earth road, a sound that had become foreign. A man rode into the yard, slouching in the saddle with an air of casual ownership that set her nerves on edge even before he drew close enough for recognition. When he dismounted and his eyes fell upon her, a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. It was Jareth. A man from the fringes of her old life, an associate of the man she had fled, a man who dealt in favors and information and took his payment in coin or in cruelty. Her blood ran cold, the fork slipping from her suddenly numb fingers to stick upright in the soil. Well, Jareth drawled, his gaze crawling over her from her work-roughened hands to the simple braid of her hair. The songbird who flew the cage. We wondered where you'd found to perch. Fancied yourself a farmer's wife, did you? His tone was slick with mockery. Before she could form a word, Cale was there, appearing from the direction of the pasture with the steady, deliberate stride of a man approaching a threat. He positioned himself slightly between Liana and the stranger, his posture radiating a protective solidity. State your business, Cale said, his voice low and flat. Jareth's smile didn't falter. Just checking on an old friend. Making sure our Liana here is well. She left quite suddenly. Left some debts unpaid, some feelings hurt. He let the implication hang, his eyes flicking to Cale and back to her, assessing the situation. A man of substance might be concerned to find he's sheltering a woman of her flexible morality. She's always been good at finding a warm place to roost, for a price. Liana felt the words like physical blows, each one a nail seeking to seal her back into the coffin of her past. She opened her mouth, a defense or a plea trembling on her lips, but Cale spoke first. He did not shout. He did not clench his fists, though every muscle in his broad back was corded tight. Instead, he took a single step forward, his flinty eyes locking onto Jareth's. You will mind your tongue on my land, he said, each word chiseled from ice. She is not for trade. She is not a debt to be collected. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice deepened, resonating with a finality that echoed off the quiet hills. She is mine. And I am hers. The declaration hung in the clear spring air, absolute and unassailable. It was not a claim of ownership as over a possession, but a proclamation of allegiance, of a bond forged in shared solitude and surrendered hearts. Jareth's smugness faltered. He saw no uncertainty in Cale's eyes, only a cold, ready violence that promised no quarter if the conversation continued. He measured the rancher's solid frame against his own, the remote emptiness of the land around them, and the lack of any advantage. With a dismissive sniff, Jareth took a step back toward his horse. "A fool and his charity," he muttered, but the words lacked force. He swung into the saddle, casting one last, lingering look at Lyanna, a look that now held more wariness than malice. "This isn't over," he said, but it was a weak threat, thrown from a retreating position. He turned his horse and kicked it into a trot, disappearing back down the road the way he had come. Silence rushed back in, louder than before. Lyanna stood rooted, shaking from head to toe, the venom of Jareth's words still poisoning the air around her. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the old, familiar shame rise like a tide, threatening to drown the fragile happiness of the past weeks. How could Cale look at her now without seeing the truth Jareth had spat onto the ground between them? She felt him move before he touched her. He turned to face her, and she braced for coldness, for doubt. Instead, she saw only a fierce, unwavering light in his gray eyes. He closed the distance and, to her utter shock, went down on one knee in the soft earth before her. He took her muddy, trembling hands in his own, his grip firm and warm. "Look at me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. When she forced her tear-filled eyes to meet his, he continued. "That man, his words, they are dust. They mean nothing." He squeezed her hands. "You are not who you were. You are the woman who stood beside me through the winter. You are the warmth in my house and the peace in my heart." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "The bargain we made is ashes. I ask for a new one. Give me your true heart, Lyanna. Let me protect it, cherish it, for all my days. Stay. Not until spring. Forever." The sobs broke free then, great, heaving waves of relief and awe. She sank to her knees in the dirt with him, their faces level. She could only nod, her voice lost. She brought his work-roughened hands to her lips and kissed his scarred knuckles, a vow in the gesture. That night, their lovemaking was different yet again. It was not the frantic conflagration of their breaking point, nor the joyful exploration of the following days. It was a solemn, deeply passionate ceremony. Every touch was a pledge, every kiss a seal upon the promise made in the garden. He worshipped her body as if sanctifying it, driving out the ghost of Jareth's words with the physical truth of his devotion. When they joined, it was with a profound, aching slowness, their eyes locked in the moonlight streaming through the window. In that silent, powerful communion, bodies moving as one, they spoke the vows their lips had not yet formally uttered. He was hers. She was his. Not as property, but as partners. Not as a bargain, but as a choice. And in the quiet aftermath, as they lay entwined, Lyanna knew the last of her old fears had been burned away in the furnace of his unwavering acceptance. The outside world had come, and it had found her not as a fugitive, but as a woman fiercely, irrevocably claimed and claiming in return. The world did not simply turn green, it erupted. Where there had been monochrome silence, a riot of life now clamored. The pastures grew thick and emerald, dotted with wildflowers like spilled paint, butter yellow, sky blue, deep violet. The creek, freed from its icy muzzle, sang a constant, chattering song as it rushed past the homestead. The air itself was a living thing, warm and soft, carrying the scent of turned earth, blooming clover, and the potent, green promise of growth. It was a season of beginnings, and within the sturdy log walls of the ranch, a beginning of a different, deeper kind was taking root. The formal words were spoken under the vast, cloud-dappled sky, with only the indifferent witness of the hills and the curious eyes of grazing cattle for an audience. A traveling circuit rider, making his spring rounds, had paused at their request. There were no fine clothes. Liana wore her one good dress, the one she had arrived in, now clean and mended. Cale stood in his simple, brushed shirt, his hands clasping hers as if she were the only anchor in a swirling world. The promises were plain, ancient, and unadorned, to have and to hold, for better or worse. But when Cale spoke his vows, his voice, usually so reserved, resonated with a conviction that seemed to still the very breeze. When Liana spoke hers, her eyes, bright with unshed tears, never left his face. The ring he placed on her finger was not of gold, but of braided silver, crafted secretly by his own hands during the long winter nights, a circle without beginning or end, strong, intertwined, and beautiful in its simplicity. When the writer pronounced them husband and wife, and Cale leaned down to kiss her, it felt less like a new contract and more like the gentle, official seal upon a truth their hearts had already known for weeks. That night, the bedroom was no longer just Cale's room, or the place of their old bargain. It was theirs. A small vase of plucked wildflowers sat on the chest, a splash of careless color in the functional space. There was no shyness, no tentative exploration, only the profound joy of a journey's end and a road stretching openly before them. Their lovemaking was a celebration, a laughing, tender, and deeply intimate revelry. They knew each other's bodies now as they knew the land, every sensitive hollow, every scar, every response. There was a playful confidence in her touch as she guided him, a reverent hunger in his mouth as he tasted her. When they joined, it was with a perfect, synchronized rhythm that spoke of practiced harmony, a physical echo of the partnership they had forged in daily life. The peak they reached together was not a frantic escape, but a slow, soaring ascent into a shared sun, leaving them breathless, tangled, and utterly complete in the quiet afterglow. Weeks melted into the gentle rhythm of late spring. The garden Liana tended flourished under her care. The livestock grew sleek. And within Liana, another, more secret spring was unfolding. She noticed the changes in small, telltale signs, a new heaviness in her breasts, a curious fatigue in the afternoons, a fleeting wave of nausea in the mornings that soon passed. She said nothing at first, holding the possibility close, a precious, fragile secret. But one evening, as they sat on the stoop watching the sunset bleed gold and rose across the valley, her hand resting absently on her abdomen, she knew with a sudden, bone-deep certainty. She turned to him, the last of the sun catching in her hair. "Cale," she said, her voice soft but clear. He looked at her, his expression open, content. She took his large, calloused hand and brought it to rest, palm flat, against the still flat plane of her belly. She watched his face, saw the confusion in his eyes give way to a dawning, staggering comprehension. It was not a question she asked, but a truth she placed in his hands. His breath caught. His gaze dropped to their joined hands on her stomach, then flew back to her face, searching for confirmation. The awe that spread across his features was more profound than any smile. It was a sunrise of its own. He pulled her into his arms, not with passion, but with a trembling, overwhelming reverence, his face buried in the curve of her neck. No words were needed. The new life within her was the final, irrevocable stitch weaving their two separate histories into a single, unbreakable future. The story of the woman who came in the storm and the rancher who offered a bargain was now a part of the valley's lore, a tale for the long winter nights to come. But as Liana stood at the fence line one luminous morning, her hand resting on the gentle swell that was just beginning to show beneath her apron, she felt no connection to that desperate ghost of the past. She was simply home. She watched Cale in the far field, guiding the plow behind the steady horses, and her heart swelled with a quiet, ferocious love. Their love had been unexpected, forged in need, tempered in conflict, and sealed in acceptance. It was as real and enduring as the land beneath her feet. She looked out over their green and growing world, toward the endless horizon, and knew that every season to come, the lush summers, the abundant autumns, even the returning winters, would be faced together, a family born not of blood, but of a choice made in the dark, and nurtured into the everlasting light. Did this journey from a desperate bargain to an unexpected forever captivate you? If you yearn for more tales of love forged in unique circumstances, of passion that heals old wounds, and of endings that feel like true beginnings, consider joining our community of readers. Subscribe for future stories where hearts find their way home against all odds. Your next adventure in romance awaits.